Christmas Eve, 1974. A police station in Melbourne, Australia. A detective asks a well-dressed Englishman to remove his trousers. Tinsel drooped from a filing cabinet. Someone had sellotaped a paper angel to the duty sergeant's lamp. The temperature outside nudged 35 degrees, and the building smelt of sweat, instant coffee, and the particular tension that settles over any workplace forced to operate on a holiday. The request was not made lightly. For several weeks, the Victoria Police had been watching this particular Englishman, a tall, composed figure in his late 40s, well-spoken, well-groomed, and travelling under the name of Joseph Arthur Markham. He had been staying in one of Melbourne's better hotels. He ate well. He tipped generously. He visited the bank with a regularity that suggested either impeccable financial discipline or something else entirely. And he bore a passing resemblance to a man the whole of Britain was desperate to find. 7 weeks earlier, on the 7th of November, Richard John Bingham, the 7th Earl of Lucan, known to his friends as Lucky, had bludgeoned his children's nanny, Sandra Rivet, to death in the basement of his London home. He had mistaken her for his wife. When he realized the error, he attacked his wife as well, though she survived. Then Lord Lucan vanished. His car was found abandoned at Newhaven, blood smeared across the seats. The man himself was never seen again. Not that week, not that year, not ever. Scotland Yard circulated his photograph across the Commonwealth. And here in Melbourne, on Christmas Eve, a detective held that photograph next to the face of Mr. Joseph Arthur Markham and thought, perhaps, "I need you to lower your trousers, sir." The Englishman looked at him, not with fear, not with outrage, with something closer to boredom, the weary disdain of a man who has been interrupted during something important by someone beneath his station. On what grounds? Lord Lucan has a distinctive scar. We need to rule you out. The trousers came down. The detective examined what needed examining. There was no scar. The man standing in his underwear in a Melbourne police station beneath a drooping paper angel and the hum of fluorescent lighting was not Lord Lucan. He was someone else entirely. He was a member of the British Parliament, a former Postmaster General of Her Majesty's government. 5 weeks earlier, he had been mourned by colleagues, eulogized in the Times, and wept over by his wife and 3 children. He had drowned off the coast of Miami, Florida, or so the world believed. His clothes had been found folded on the beach. His body had not been recovered. A memorial was held. Condolences were sent. The Prime Minister himself had offered words of sorrow. And yet here he stood, alive, tanned. Inexpensive underwear. In a hotel room booked under a dead man's name, with a suitcase containing a second passport, a quantity of cash, and the itinerary of a woman flying from London to join him. A woman who was not his wife. His name was John Stonehouse. And this, the trousers, the detective, the paper angel, was not even the most extraordinary part of his story. Not by a considerable margin. The autumn of 1974 was, even by the febrile standards of that decade, an exercise in collective disintegration. Harold Wilson's Labour government had scraped back into power in October, winning a majority so thin it could be defeated by a bout of influenza. Inflation was running at 25%. The memory of the 3-day working week, imposed earlier that year when the miners' strike had crippled the power supply, still clung to the national mood like the smell of unlit rooms. Then, on the 7th of November, Lord Lucan murdered Sandra Rivet and disappeared. The tabloids erupted. Here was everything Fleet Street dreamed of: an earl, a nanny, a bloodied lead pipe, a wife with a fractured skull, and a vanishing act worthy of a penny dreadful. 13 days later, on the 20th of November, John Stonehouse walked onto a beach at the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami Beach, Florida, and left his clothes folded in a neat pile on the sand. Then he walked away. No note, no farewell. Just a tidy stack of garments and a wallet containing identification in his own name. The following day, the 21st of November, the Irish Republican Army detonated bombs in 2 public houses in Birmingham. 21 people died. 182 were injured. It was the deadliest attack on English soil in living memory. And so November 1974 presented Britain with a grotesque triptych: an aristocrat who had killed and vanished, a politician who had faked his death and fled, and 21 ordinary men and women drinking after work on a Thursday evening who were murdered and largely forgotten within a fortnight. The privileged disappeared. The powerful escaped. The rest simply died. But before the full absurdity of Stonehouse's disappearance can be understood, one detail must be noted, a detail that emerged only decades later when classified documents were released in 2005. He had rehearsed. On several occasions prior to that November, the former minister had visited beaches, removed his clothes, left them in a pile, and simply watched. He timed how long it took for someone to notice, how many hours before the police arrived. He recorded these observations with the diligence of a man planning a military operation, or, perhaps more accurately, with the diligence of a mediocre playwright staging his own death scene and wanting to get the blocking right. This was not a breakdown. It was a plan. And to understand why he needed one, we must go further back, past the beach and the bombs, past Westminster and the Cold War, to a port city on the south coast of England, where a boy was born into a family that believed, with the unquestioning fervor of the faithful, that politics could save the world. In 20 years, that boy would be passing documents to Czechoslovak intelligence officers. In 30, he would be standing in his underwear in a Melbourne police station. In 40, a nation would mourn him, though he would be alive, sunburned, and eating steak by a swimming pool 12,000 miles away. But for now, it was the 28th of July, 1925, and the boy had just arrived. His father, William Mitchell Stonehouse, was a trade union official and a Labour Party organiser, a man of firm convictions and modest means, who spoke of justice with the quiet certainty of someone who had seen its absence at close range. His mother, Rosina, née Price, was a cooperative movement activist who would, in later years, become mayor of Southampton, a detail that explains much about the household in which young John grew up. In the Stonehouse family, politics was the air they breathed, the rhythm of their evenings, the substance of their arguments, and the measure of their worth. The boy was clever. Everyone agreed on that. Quick with words, easy with a smile, able to read a room before he could properly read a book. Southampton was a port city, a place defined by departure. Ships left from here for New York, for Bombay, for Cape Town. The boy watched them go. He understood instinctively that the world was larger than the docks, and that the people who left were more interesting than the people who stayed. He would leave. Of course he would. The only question was how far. The London School of Economics provided the first answer. He arrived there in the years after the war, a young man from a working-class family, sharp-suited, sharp-tongued, burning with the particular energy of someone who has decided that charm is a currency and intends to spend it freely. His fellow students gave him a nickname, as students do. They called him Lord John. He took it as a compliment. It was not entirely meant as one. There is a certain kind of young man who arrives at university and discovers not knowledge but audience, for whom the lecture hall is not a place of learning but a stage. Stonehouse was such a man. He could argue, persuade, perform, but the brilliance was always directed outward, always aimed at the room. Those who knew him would later observe that beneath the polish there was something restless, something hungry, something that needed to be seen and admired and told that it mattered. In 1948, he married Barbara Jones Smith. He was 23. She was educated, steady, and she believed in him not merely in his charm, but in the substance she was certain lay beneath it. Post-war Britain was a country of ration books and bomb sites and defiant optimism. Young couples married quickly in those years. Life had proved itself short, and the future felt as though it belonged to people like them. Barbara was not a decoration. She was a partner, the kind of political wife who did not merely attend functions but organized them, who believed in her husband's cause because she shared it. She walked the streets with him, knocked on doors, addressed envelopes, made tea for canvassers, and absorbed, without complaint, the long absences that political life demanded. They had 3 children. The family settled into the rhythm of a Labour household in the 50s, meetings, pamphlets, constituency work. From the outside, it looked like a solid marriage. From the inside, well, only 2 people ever know the inside of a marriage, and one of them was already rehearsing for a different life, though neither knew it yet. The early signs were small. He was away too often. He promised too easily. He carried himself with a certainty that left no room for doubt, his own or anyone else's. Barbara was the foundation of the house. John was the facade. It is a common enough arrangement, and it can last a lifetime, provided the facade never decides it no longer needs the foundation. In February 1957, at the age of 31, Stonehouse won a by-election in the constituency of Wednesbury in the West Midlands. He was among the youngest and most photogenic of the new Labour intake. Harold Macmillan was Prime Minister, telling the country it had never had it so good. Stonehouse was the living rebuttal, a man from the other Britain, the one that had not yet been invited to the party. He threw himself into parliamentary life with ferocious energy. He made speeches. He asked questions. He cultivated journalists. He travelled, not merely across the country but across the world, with a particular fascination for Africa, where the tides of decolonization were reshaping the map. Rhodesia, Uganda, Kenya. The new member for Wednesbury positioned himself as a champion of independence movements, a voice for the colonized. The international stage offered something that Wednesbury could not: scale. Here was a role large enough for his self-image. In 1964, Harold Wilson led Labour to a narrow victory, and Stonehouse received his first government appointments, junior ministerial posts that placed him on the lower rungs of power, but within sight of the cabinet table. The party managers noted his competence. The whips noted his ambition, which was considerable, and his loyalty, which was conditional. The press noted his suits, which were expensive, and somewhere in the background, unnoticed by the newspapers, unrecorded in Hansard, something else was happening. The promising young parliamentarian was meeting people. Eastern European diplomats, cultural attachés, representatives of fraternal socialist parties in Czechoslovakia. On the surface, entirely unremarkable. Members of Parliament met foreign diplomats all the time. Parliamentary work, international solidarity, or so it appeared. In 1962, John Stonehouse travelled to Prague. Officially, a parliamentary visit, one of dozens that backbench MPs undertook every year. Unofficially, it was the beginning of a story that Britain would not learn for 47 years. Prague in the early 60s was a city of Baroque facades and listening devices, of coffeehouse intellectuals and secret policemen. The Statny Bezpichnost, the St. B, the Czechoslovak State Security Service, had refined its tradecraft to a high and cynical art. They knew how to spot a useful foreigner. They knew what to offer, and when, and how to make the offering feel like flattery rather than recruitment. What exactly happened? In which hotel room, which restaurant, which discreet apartment, remains unclear. The precise mechanics of Stonehouse's recruitment have never been fully documented, at least not in any file released to the public. What is known, confirmed by the historian Christopher Andrew in his authorized history of MI5, published in 2009, is this. By 1962, the Member of Parliament for Wednesbury had become an agent of the St. B. 3 possibilities have been discussed over the decades. The first is the honey trap, the oldest gambit in the intelligence handbook, in which a target is compromised through a sexual encounter and then coerced into cooperation. No evidence has surfaced to support it specifically. The second is ideological sympathy. He came from a socialist family. Perhaps the Czechs framed their approach as solidarity, comrades helping comrades. The third is the simplest and most damning: money. The MI5 files confirm that he received payments. Not vast sums. He was no Philby, commanding the resources of an entire network, but enough. Perhaps it was all 3. Perhaps it was something harder to categorize: the intoxication of secrecy itself. For a man who craved importance, the possession of a genuine secret, one that placed him above the ordinary run of parliamentarians, may have been reward enough. To sit in the House of Commons and carry, beneath the well-cut suit, a hidden life that made the visible one seem almost trivial. What did he give them? According to MI5's own assessment, not a great deal. He was, in the brutal parlance of intelligence professionals, of limited operational value. He was not Kim Philby, betraying networks and agents. He was not Anthony Blunt, passing strategic secrets from the heart of the establishment. He was a source of low-grade political intelligence, gossip really, dressed up as espionage, the mood of the Labour Party, the personalities of ministers. And yet the St. B maintained the relationship, and Stonehouse maintained it too, for years. He spied for the communists and lived like a capitalist: expensive restaurants, good clubs, tailored suits. The contradiction did not trouble him. He was, after all, a man of exceptional compartmentalization. He had been practicing that skill since childhood. He changed. He became Markham. The transformation was not dramatic, no disguise, no wig, no false moustache. He simply put on different clothes and carried different papers. The face was the same. Voice was the same. The bearing, confident, slightly imperious, accustomed to deference, was the same. Only the name had changed. It was the smallest possible reinvention. A man who alters nothing about himself except the label. A taxi to the airport. a ticket under the Markham name. According to his daughter Julia's account, his route took him through San Francisco and onward, though the precise itinerary has never been fully confirmed by any official source. He was covering his tracks, or trying to. What is beyond dispute is the destination: Melbourne, Australia, 12,000 miles from Miami, 12,000 miles from Barbara, 12,000 miles from the Department of Trade and Industry and its meticulous, patient, damning investigation. He flew first class. A man fleeing from financial ruin, traveling on a dead man's passport with stolen money in his suitcase, and he chose the front of the aircraft. Champagne, linen napkins, and legroom sufficient for a gentleman of means. Even in flight, especially in flight, the performance continued. Behind him in Miami, the clothes remained on the beach. Hotel staff discovered them in the early evening. A neat pile undisturbed, the wallet still on top. They notified the front desk. The front desk called the police. The police searched the water, briefly, in the fading light. No body was recovered. The following morning, the newspapers carried the story. MP feared drowned off Miami Beach. The Times published an obituary, a dignified summary of a political career cut short by apparent tragedy. Colleagues in the Parliamentary Labour Party spoke of their shock. Harold Wilson, who had once stood in the Commons to defend this same man against accusations of espionage, offered his personal condolences. There was talk of a memorial service. Letters of sympathy arrived from across the political spectrum. A few backbenchers recalled his work on decolonization, his energy, his commitment. Nobody mentioned Prague. Nobody mentioned the St. B. Nobody mentioned the Department of Trade and Industry's ongoing investigation, which was now, presumably, rendered moot by the death of its principal subject. And at the headquarters of MI5, the news was received with what? Relief, perhaps, or at least the bureaucratic equivalent of a shrug. The Stonehouse problem, which had lingered for 5 years like a low-grade infection, appeared to have resolved itself. A dead spy is a closed file. If anyone within the intelligence community suspected that the drowning was too convenient, that the absence of a body was too conspicuous, that the neatly folded clothes had the quality of a stage direction rather than a genuine last act, they kept their suspicions to themselves. 12,000 miles away, Mr. Joseph Arthur Markham checked into a comfortable hotel in Melbourne. He settled in quickly. Melbourne in late November was heading into summer, warm days, long evenings, a city that wore its prosperity with an easy, outdoor confidence, quite different from the grey anxieties of London. Markham, though we must remember he was trying very hard not to be Stonehouse any longer, took a room with a view. He ate well. He walked the streets. He visited the bank, presenting his credentials and withdrawing funds from accounts prepared months in advance. He was not, by any reasonable standard, in hiding. He was on holiday. Sheila arrived via Copenhagen. The stopover in Denmark was part of the plan, a way of obscuring the direct connection between London and Melbourne. Whether it served any practical purpose as a deception is debatable. What it certainly served was as evidence. When the story unraveled, the Copenhagen connection would prove that Sheila Buckley had known, that she had participated, that her journey was not the innocent travel of a grieving secretary, but the calculated movement of a woman who understood exactly where she was going and why. They were together in Melbourne. Finally, openly, or as openly as two people using false names in a foreign country can be. The secret maintained for 5 years in London was no longer necessary. He was dead. She was free. They could begin. What did that beginning look like? It looked like room service and swimming pools and long afternoons with nothing to do and no one to account to. It looked like a man reading newspapers from home, newspapers that contained, in their back pages, his own obituary. It looked like freedom, if freedom is defined as the absence of consequence. For roughly 4 weeks, that is precisely what it was. But Stonehouse, even as Markham, even 12,000 miles from Westminster, even officially deceased, could not suppress the habits that had shaped his life. He spent money visibly. He visited the bank repeatedly. He carried 2 passports and used them with a casualness that a more disciplined fugitive would have avoided. And the Victoria police, who had been watching him for reasons that initially had nothing to do with British politics, began to find his behavior interesting. They had noticed him because of the passports. A man using 2 different identities at 2 different banks attracted attention, not because it was necessarily criminal, but because it was unusual. And unusual behavior, in the experience of the Melbourne constabulary, tended to repay investigation. They ran the names. Markham, Muldoon. Neither returned a criminal record, but neither could be satisfactorily verified. The man did not quite fit his own documentation. And then someone, a detective with a good memory, or perhaps just a detective who read the papers, noticed something else. The mysterious Englishman bore a resemblance to the photograph that had been circulating since November, the photograph of Lord Lucan, wanted for murder, missing since the 7th of that month. The resemblance was not exact, but it was close enough to warrant a telephone call. The call went to Scotland Yard. The response was not what Melbourne expected. "We have an Englishman here," the Australian detective explained. "Travelling under false papers. We think he might be Lucan." There was a pause, the particular pause of a British police officer recalibrating his understanding of a situation. "Describe him." The description was given: height, build, age, manner. "That is not Lord Lucan." "Then who is he?" "His name is Stonehouse, John Stonehouse. He was a member of Parliament." "Was?" "He drowned 5 weeks ago, off Miami." A longer pause. "He is not drowned. He is staying at a hotel here under the name Markham." On the 24th of December, 1974, Christmas Eve, the day of paper angels and tinsel on filing cabinets, the Victoria police arrested John Stonehouse at his Melbourne hotel. The scene, which opened this account, now returns, but from the inside rather than the outside. The detectives who entered his room found a man who was not surprised. He had been expecting something, the faint anxiety of the fugitive, the half-conscious awareness that every knock on the door might be the last ordinary knock he hears. The matter of the trousers was dealt with. He was not Lucan. That much was established. What he was, a resurrected member of Parliament, a fraudster, a man who had caused his own family to mourn him, was a more complex determination, and one that would occupy the British legal system for the better part of 2 years. His first words, once the formalities of identification were complete, were characteristic. He did not apologize. He did not express remorse. He did not ask about Barbara or his children or the memorial service held in his honor. "I am not a criminal. I simply wanted to begin a new life." He was sincere. That was the disturbing part. He genuinely believed that what he had done, the false passports, the stolen identities, the insurance implications, the abandoned family, the manufactured grief, was not a crime but a liberation. That other people had been damaged in the process was, in his accounting, their misfortune rather than his fault. The extradition proceedings took months. He fought them, naturally. He had no intention of returning to Britain quietly, and even less intention of returning as a prisoner. The legal arguments were technical, the hearings protracted, and the media coverage relentless. The story had everything Fleet Street could wish for: a disgraced MP, a faked death, a younger woman, a tropical beach, false identities, and the lingering comparison with Lord Lucan that gave the whole affair a flavour of aristocratic scandal it did not quite deserve. On the 17th of July, 1975, John Stonehouse was extradited to the United Kingdom. He arrived at Heathrow to flashbulbs, shouted questions, and the particular frenzy that the British press reserves for public figures caught doing something they should not have done. And then he did something that no one expected, though in retrospect it was entirely predictable. He went to the House of Commons. His parliamentary seat had not been vacated. He had not resigned. He had not been expelled. The mechanisms for removing a sitting member of Parliament are cumbersome and rarely invoked, and in the confusion of his disappearance, presumed death and resurrection, nobody had got around to initiating them. John Stonehouse was still, legally and constitutionally, the Member of Parliament for Walsall North. So he walked into the chamber, sat down, and listened to the debate. As though nothing had happened, as though he had merely been away, on holiday perhaps, or recovering from an illness. Colleagues who had eulogized him stared. Colleagues who had sent flowers to his wife looked at their shoes. The speaker maintained order, because that is what speakers do, but the atmosphere that day was unlike anything the oldest members could recall. The specific, suffocating awkwardness of a funeral at which the deceased turns up and asks for a cup of tea. In the autumn of 1975, he addressed the House. The speech was long, self-justifying, and delivered with the fluency of a man who has rehearsed his lines so thoroughly that he has come to believe them. He spoke of what he called a psychiatric suicide, the deliberate killing of his former self, the creation of a new identity not as an act of fraud, but as an act of psychological survival. He described the pressures, financial burdens, political isolation, the suffocating weight of a life that no longer felt like his own. He spoke of himself as someone who had been crushed by circumstances and who had found the courage, his word, courage, to escape. The House listened in a silence that was neither respectful nor hostile. It was the silence of people who do not know what expression to wear. The trial began in April 1976 and lasted 68 days, making it, at the time, one of the longest criminal proceedings in English legal history. Stonehouse dismissed his legal counsel and stood before the court as his own advocate, a decision that surprised no one who knew him. Even facing 21 charges, fraud, theft, forgery, conspiracy, obtaining a false passport, and the lesser but symbolically resonant charge of wasting police time, he could not relinquish the leading role. The courtroom was his stage, and he intended to command it. His defense was built on the psychiatric argument. He was not a criminal, he insisted. He was a man who had suffered a dissociative episode, a splitting of personality so profound that the person who had committed these acts The person who had opened false accounts, forged documents, deceived his family, was not, in any meaningful psychological sense, him. Joseph Markham had done these things. Joseph Markham was a separate entity. John Stonehouse, the real John Stonehouse, was himself a victim. The psychiatric evidence did not support this claim. Expert witnesses called by the prosecution found no indication of dissociative identity disorder. One psychiatrist noted, with the careful understatement of his profession, features consistent with a narcissistic personality, a diagnosis that, while not exculpatory, at least provided a framework for understanding how a man could cause such damage and feel so little responsibility. Sheila Buckley stood in the dock beside him, charged as his accomplice. She conducted herself with a composure that contrasted sharply with his theatrics, quiet, contained, answering questions directly and without elaboration. The jury acquitted her on the majority of charges. Not all, but most. She walked from the court diminished but not destroyed. He did not walk anywhere. On the 6th of August, 1976, John Stonehouse was found guilty and sentenced to 7 years' imprisonment. The judge's remarks were measured but pointed. The sentence reflected, he said, the gravity of offences committed by a man who had abused the trust of the public and of those closest to him. The former Postmaster General received the verdict standing. His face betrayed nothing. He was taken to Wormwood Scrubs. The prison was old, overcrowded and grim, a Victorian edifice in West London whose name alone carried a weight of institutional misery. The former cabinet minister was assigned a cell, a number, and a routine. He was, for the first time in his adult life, a man without an audience, or almost without one. In the exercise yard and the common areas, he encountered the other residents of Wormwood Scrubs, burglars, forgers, armed robbers, and in one notable case, a man whose crimes occupied an entirely different category of human darkness. Ian Brady, one half of the partnership responsible for the Moors murders, the abduction, torture, and killing of 5 children in the 1960s, was also an inmate. The two men played chess together. 2 intelligent men, 2 manipulators, 2 people who had constructed elaborate internal justifications for their actions, seated across a checkered board in a prison common room. The image requires no commentary. It provides its own. The former minister also lodged a complaint with the prison administration about the pop music that played in the workshop. He felt it was inappropriate. He suggested, or perhaps demanded, that it be replaced with something more suitable. Classical music or silence. The request was denied. The man who had reshaped the postal system of the United Kingdom, who had passed secrets to a foreign power, who had faked his own death and flown first class to Australia on a dead man's passport, could not persuade the authorities at Wormwood Scrubs to change the radio station. He wrote, of course. Prison provided both the time and the subject matter for something more ambitious than parliamentary speeches. The autobiography was titled Death of an Idealist, not Confessions of a Fraud. Not a letter to Barbara. Death of an Idealist. Even in a cell, he remained the protagonist of his own story, noble, misunderstood, betrayed by a world that had failed to recognize his qualities. In the book, there were flashes of something that might, with charity, be called insight. He described the pressure, the paranoia, the sensation of walls closing in, financial walls, legal walls, psychological walls. He wrote about the moment when escape stops being a fantasy and becomes the only remaining option, when the imagined future acquires such solidity that the actual present begins to feel like the fiction. It was not an apology, but it was, perhaps, the closest he ever came to explaining himself honestly, not to the public, not to the court, but to himself. His body, however, was less accommodating than his self-image. In April 1977, less than a year into his sentence, he suffered his first serious heart attack. In August 1978, a second. The diagnosis was ischemic heart disease, a progressive narrowing of the coronary arteries that restricted blood flow and would, in time, kill him. By the autumn of 78, surgery could no longer be postponed. In November, he underwent a coronary artery bypass, open heart surgery, performed on a convicted criminal who was also a former cabinet minister. The surgeons gave him time. They could not give him certainty. The prison doctors recommended early release. The Home Office, after the usual deliberations, agreed. On the 14th of August, 1979, John Stonehouse walked out of Wormwood Scrubs, having served 3 years of his 7-year sentence. He was 54 years old. He was a bankrupt. He was a convicted fraudster with a surgical scar down his chest and a weakened heart. No career, no reputation, no party, no plan. Outside the gates, Britain had changed. Margaret Thatcher had become Prime Minister 3 months earlier. The country was harder, faster, less forgiving. The Labour Party was tearing itself apart. The Cold War was entering its final, frozen decade. Nothing was as it had been. Nothing was waiting for him, except Sheila. He did not go to his children. He went to her. It was the first decision he made as a free man, and it told the whole story more concisely than any autobiography could. 3 children in London, growing up with the wreckage of his choices, and he drove to the woman for whom, as he would later insist, the entire catastrophe had been worthwhile. Whether the children registered the direction of that car is not recorded in any public document, but children notice everything. They simply do not always say so at the time. Barbara had already gone. The divorce had been finalized in 1978, while he was still inside, 26 years dissolved by paperwork, though the actual dissolution had occurred long before any solicitor became involved. She had endured the affair, the disappearance, the false mourning, the resurrection, the trial, and the daily humiliation of being the wife of the most publicly ridiculous man in Britain. She had endured all of it in silence. The contrast between the 2 women is instructive, not in their characters, which were both formidable, but in their responses to the same man. Barbara chose silence as a form of dignity. Sheila chose silence as a form of loyalty. Both declined the tabloid check, the television confessional, the ghost-written account. But where Barbara's silence said, "I will not dignify this," Sheila's said, "I have made my choice, and I owe you no explanation." The first was the quiet of a wound. The second was the quiet of a resolution. On the 31st of January, 1981, John Stonehouse married Sheila Elizabeth Buckley. The ceremony was subdued, not by preference, one suspect, but by necessity. No crowds of well-wishers. No parliamentary colleagues raising glasses. A few photographers lingered outside, but not many. The story was old by then. Britain in 81 was consumed by unemployment, urban riots, and the early convulsions of Thatcherism. A disgraced former MP marrying his former secretary barely merited a paragraph on page 9. They had a son. James William John Stonehouse, a boy whose father had been officially dead for 7 years before he was born, whose surname carried a weight of notoriety that no child should be asked to bear. The cabinet minister's son grew up not in Westminster, but in a modest house, with a father who was bankrupt and a mother who had been tried as an accessory to fraud. Was Sheila happy? The question is unanswerable, and perhaps irrelevant, since happiness is a condition most people experience intermittently, and even those who possess it are rarely qualified to diagnose. What can be said is that she stayed. Through the bankruptcy and the obscurity, through the health scares and the diminished circumstances, she stayed. Not with the grim endurance of someone trapped, but with the settled determination of someone who had weighed the alternatives and found them wanting. She had waited 12 years for this man. She had survived a criminal trial. She was not about to leave because the house was smaller than expected. Stonehouse, meanwhile, proved incapable of the retirement his circumstances demanded. The world had forgotten him, but he had not forgotten the world. In June 1980, his bankruptcy was discharged. He celebrated this by doing what he had always done, seeking a platform. He joined the English National Party, a small, earnest group dedicated to celebrating English culture, observing St. George's Day, and promoting Morris dancing. Its membership could have fitted into a village hall, and its political influence was precisely zero. That a former cabinet minister chose this as his vehicle for re-entry into public life tells us everything about the distance between his self-image and reality. He moved on. The Social Democratic Party, the SDP, founded in 1981 by the Gang of Four who had broken from Labour, offered a more plausible home. The SDP would later merge with the Liberals to form the Liberal Democrats, but by then his involvement had faded to nothing. Nobody took him seriously. Nobody sought his endorsement. He was a curiosity, a man whose name provoked not anger but a faint, uncomfortable smile. He wrote fiction, spy novels as it happened. The irony was apparently unintentional. A man who had actually spied, who had actually been caught, writing fictional espionage for a readership with no idea how closely the author's experience matched his subject matter. The novels were, by critical consensus, mediocre. The plots were serviceable but lacked tension. It was as though the extraordinary raw material of his own life had been processed through a machine that removed everything interesting and produced something merely adequate. He worked as a fundraiser, small organizations, minor causes, the kind of work that required a telephone and a willingness to ask people for money. Skills he possessed in abundance, though his track record with other people's finances was, to put it gently, checkered. He appeared on television occasionally, always willing to discuss his case, always prepared to explain why the world had misunderstood him. The interviews grew less frequent as the years passed. The invitations dried up. The telephone rang less often. They settled in Totton, Hampshire, a small town adjacent to Southampton, the city where he had been born nearly 60 years earlier. The boy who had watched ships leave the port for distant destinations had travelled to London, to Prague, to Miami, to Melbourne, to Wormwood Scrubs, and had come to rest 2 miles from where he started. The circle was not yet complete, but it was closing. His daughter Julia visited. The relationship was difficult, scarred by abandonment, complicated by love, made almost impossible by the fact that loving a person and approving of their actions are two entirely separate operations. She found him changed. Softer, she would later write. Less certain. The armor of self-justification that had carried him through the trial and prison had thinned, though it had not disappeared. He still gave interviews in which he maintained the world had treated him unfairly. But he gave them less frequently, with less conviction, and sometimes rarely, but sometimes with a quality that might, in a different man, have been mistaken for doubt. His heart continued to deteriorate. The bypass of 1978 had bought time, but time, in cardiology as in all things, is a loan rather than a gift. He took medication. He experienced breathlessness. The scar on his chest reminded him daily that the organ keeping him alive was unreliable. It had always been unreliable in every sense of the word. Now it was unreliable in the literal one as well. While the former minister lived his quiet, diminished life in Totten, his past was undergoing a slow-motion exhumation in the filing rooms of the British state. In 1980, a document had landed on the desk of the Prime Minister. Margaret Thatcher was presented with a security briefing concerning a former Labour MP. The briefing confirmed what Frolic had alleged 11 years earlier and what Wilson had publicly denied. John Stonehouse had been an agent of the Czechoslovak intelligence service. The evidence was solid. The MI5 assessment was unambiguous. The question was what to do with this information. The evidence could be made public. Stonehouse could be charged under the Official Secrets Act. The trial would be sensational. But the revelations would be damaging, not merely to Stonehouse, who was already damaged beyond repair, but to the institutions through which he had moved. The Labour Party, the House of Commons, the system of security vetting that had failed to catch a foreign agent sitting in the cabinet. Thatcher made her decision. The documents would remain classified. Not because she wished to protect a Labour politician, the notion would have been laughable, but because she wished to protect the chair he had sat in. If the public learned that a cabinet minister had spied for a hostile power and the security services had known and done nothing, the damage would corrode trust in the machinery of government itself. Better to let the fraud conviction stand as the official narrative. Better to let the country remember him as a con man and a fool rather than as a traitor. It was a pragmatic calculation, and it carried a ruthless logic. But it also meant the full truth, the espionage, the MI5 file, the decision not to prosecute would remain hidden for decades. The man who had spent his life wanting to be significant was denied even the dark significance of being recognized for what he actually was. He was not Philby with his Moscow flat and his KGB pension. He was not Blunt with his royal connections and his eventual dramatic unmasking. He was just Stonehouse, the man who faked his death and got caught. The punchline to a joke that nobody found particularly funny anymore. On the 14th of April, 1988, at 2:30 in the morning, John Stonehouse suffered a massive heart attack at Southampton General Hospital. This time, there was no recovery, no adjustment of medication, no second chance. The heart that had been weakening for 11 years, that had survived 2 attacks in prison and open surgery, and a decade of diminished function, stopped. He was 62 years old. The birthday that would have fallen on the 28th of July would pass unmarked, or marked only by those who remembered him, and they were fewer, by then, than he would have wished. Who was at his bedside? No source provides a definitive answer. We do not know whether he died with someone holding his hand or whether he died alone, in the particular solitude of a hospital ward at 2:30 in the morning, when the corridors are empty and the fluorescent lights hum at a frequency that sounds like nothing and everything at once. And perhaps that, too, is part of the story. This was a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by people, constituents, colleagues, spies, journalists, judges, lovers, children, wardens. He had lived in public, performed in public, lied in public, been caught in public, been tried in public, been mourned in public twice. The possibility that he may have died in private, unseen, carries a weight that is difficult to ignore. On the 22nd of April, 1988, his body was cremated at Bassett Green Crematorium in Southampton, the city where he had been born, the city where his mother had served as mayor, the city from which ships departed for new worlds, and to which this particular voyager had returned at the end, having circumnavigated his own life and arrived back at the point of origin. The newspapers published their obituaries, their second set of obituaries. The first, in November 1974, had been respectful, even admiring, a dedicated parliamentarian, a champion of the developing world, a man of energy and conviction. Those obituaries had been wrong not in their assessment of his qualities, which were real enough, but in their fundamental premise. He had not been dead. The second obituaries, in April 1988, were different. They told the whole story, or as much of it as was known at the time. The espionage allegations, the financial fraud, the faked drowning, the arrest in Melbourne, the trial, the prison sentence, the second marriage, the quiet decline. They were not cruel, exactly. British obituary writing tends towards understatement rather than savagery. But they were honest, and the portrait they drew of a man who had been given extraordinary opportunities and had squandered everyone in pursuit of a self-image that bore no relation to reality was more devastating than any prosecution speech. Which obituary was more truthful? The first, written in ignorance, which praised a man for qualities he genuinely possessed. Or the second, written in knowledge, which catalogued his failures without entirely acknowledging his gifts. Both, and neither. The distance between the two obituaries, 14 years, a prison sentence, a new wife, a declassified file, was not merely chronological. It was the distance between who we appear to be and who we are, between the suit and the man inside it, between the folded clothes on the beach and the person who walked away from them. Every life contains that distance. Most of us are fortunate enough to die before it is measured. 3 women lived with the aftermath of John Stonehouse. 3 women whose lives he shaped, scarred, and defined, not by his presence, which was intermittent, but by his absence, which was constant. They deserve, in any honest account of this story, a full reckoning. Barbara Jones Stonehouse, née Smith, survived him. She had married him in 1948, when he was 23, and the future was a country they intended to build together. She had borne his children, supported his career, maintained his household, and presented to the world the image of a solid political marriage. She had done this for 26 years. None of it had been enough to prevent him from constructing, behind her back, a parallel existence that rendered everything she had built irrelevant. She did not write a memoir. She did not give interviews. She did not appear on chat shows to discuss the pain of betrayal. She declined every invitation to make her private suffering public, and in doing so she delivered, without uttering a word, the most comprehensive verdict on her former husband that anyone has ever pronounced. His life had been a performance. Hers was not. Her refusal to perform, to weep on camera, to rage in print, to participate in the circus his choices had created, was not passivity. It was the most forceful statement in the entire affair. I will not be a character in your story. Sheila Elizabeth Buckley, later Sheila Stonehouse, survived him too, though the nature of her survival was different. She had chosen him knowing everything, or nearly everything. She had waited through the secret years, followed him through the escape, stood beside him in the dock, and remained at his side through bankruptcy, obscurity, illness, and death. She had given him a son and a second chance at domesticity. What drove her resists easy categorization. She made a choice. She stood by it. She never recanted, never expressed public regret, never suggested she would have done anything differently. Whether this constitutes loyalty or captivity is a question that different observers will answer differently. It is not the business of this narrative to adjudicate. She never gave a substantial interview. She never wrote a book. Of all the silences in this story, and there are many, hers is perhaps the most complete. Julia Stonehouse, his daughter, took a different path. She wrote about him. Her memoir, published in 2021, is the most complete family account. More complete than the newspaper profiles, more nuanced than the court transcripts, and more painful than either of those, because it was written by someone who loved the man while hating what he did. She defends her father without excusing him. She honors his memory without falsifying it. She describes the damage without demanding compensation. It is the most difficult of the three positions. To see a person whole, the charm and the cruelty, the brilliance and the blindness, the father who read bedtime stories and the man who faked his own death, and to refuse to look away. Julian Hayes, the nephew, published his own account separately, a family view from a slightly greater distance. Close enough to feel the blast, far enough to see the crater. He confirmed what the public record suggested. The Stonehouse affair was not a scandal that ended. It was a detonation that continued in the lives of those closest to the epicenter for decades after the newspapers had moved on. The question that haunts the story, the question that Julia raises, that Barbara's silence implies, and that Sheila's loyalty complicates, is the simplest and the most unanswerable of all. Who was the real John Stonehouse? Was he the young idealist whom Barbara married in '48, the boy from Southampton with his mother's politics and his father's determination, who believed the world could be made fairer? Was he the secret agent whom Sheila never knew and Barbara never suspected? The man who sat in the Commons with a Czech code name and a monthly payment and a secret that made every public statement a lie? Was he the desperate fugitive who folded his clothes on a Miami beach and walked away from wife, children, country, and identity because the walls were closing in and he lacked the courage to face them? Was he the aging, softening figure whom Julia visited in Totten, trying, belatedly and imperfectly, to be a father to children he had abandoned? He was all of them. He was none of them. He was, perhaps, the space between them, the gap between performance and reality, between the person he presented and the person he was, between the clothes on the beach and the man who walked away. Barbara saw the young version. Sheila saw the broken one. Julia saw the old man trying to mend what could not be mended. Each knew a different person. Whether any of them knew the real one, whether the real one existed at all, or whether John Stonehouse was, in the end, nothing more than a sequence of roles played with decreasing conviction, is a question this narrative raises but cannot answer, because some questions are not designed to be answered. They are designed to be carried. The story of John Stonehouse did not end with his cremation in Southampton. It slipped into the culture and lodged there, like a splinter the body cannot quite expel. In 1975, while Stonehouse was still fighting extradition from Australia, the novelist David Nobbs published The Fall and Rise of Reginald Perrin. The book told the story of a middle-aged executive who, crushed by the banalities of his life, stages his own death by leaving his clothes on a beach and walks away to start again under a new name. The BBC turned it into a hugely popular sitcom starring Leonard Rossiter. Millions laughed. Nobbs always insisted there was no direct connection to the real events, but the timing was impossible to ignore, and the parallels were too precise to be dismissed. Reginald Perrin became the polite, middle-class way for Britain to talk about John Stonehouse without ever having to say his name. Even today, when newspapers need shorthand for a man of a certain age who suddenly disappears, they reach for doing a Reggie Perrin. The phrase has outlived the man. It has outlived the scandal. It has become a quiet, cultural acknowledgement of the desperate fantasy many men of a certain generation still carry in silence. What if I just walked away? Stonehouse himself watched the program from prison. Those who knew him said he found it both flattering and infuriating. Flattering because it turned his catastrophe into national entertainment. Infuriating because the fictional version got away with it. Perrin returns home, wiser and happier. Stonehouse returned in handcuffs. The ITV drama of 2024, starring Matthew Macfadyen as Stonehouse and Keely Hawes as Barbara, brought the story to television screens for a new generation. Macfadyen played the role with a mixture of charm and desperation that made the character almost sympathetic, until the final episodes, when the charm curdled into something colder. Viewers who had never heard the name before found themselves asking the same question their parents had asked 50 years earlier. How does a man reach the point where he believes his own disappearance will solve everything? Two disappearances, two very different men, define the autumn of 1974. Lord Lucan, gambler, aristocrat, accused murderer, vanished on the 7th of November. His blood-stained car was found. His passport remained at home. He has never been seen. The aristocracy closed ranks. The police searched for decades. The tabloids still print reported sightings. Lucan became a ghost. John Stonehouse vanished 13 days later. He left his clothes neatly folded. He flew first class on a dead man's passport. He was found, arrested, tried, imprisoned, and eventually cremated. The middle-class politician became a joke. One man killed and escaped into myth. The other killed himself and was brought back to reality. One was protected by his class. The other was exposed by his. Together they formed a bitter diptych of the Britain that was slipping away in that strange, violent autumn. An empire that could no longer keep its own ghosts in order. Yet the most haunting parallel is not between Lucan and Stonehouse. It is between the two versions of Stonehouse himself. There was the man who folded his clothes on a Miami beach and walked away believing he had outwitted everyone. And there was the man who, 14 years later, collapsed on a television set while being interviewed about people who had gone missing. The first disappearance was planned with meticulous care. The second was unplanned, undignified, and final. The first was a performance. The second was simply biology catching up with performance. Between those two moments, the beach and the studio floor, there had been a trial, a prison cell, a second marriage, a son, a heart operation, and a slow, quiet surrender to the fact that no new identity, no new country, no new woman could ever outrun the old one. He had spent his life trying to become someone else. In the end, he became exactly who he had always been, a man whose heart gave out 2 miles from the house where he was born. Every betrayal a minor infarction. Every performance a little more scar tissue on an organ that was never built to sustain the weight he placed upon it. The doctors called it ischemic heart disease. A more honest diagnosis might have been simpler. He used himself up. There is a temptation at the end of a story like this to deliver a verdict, to weigh the evidence, sum the arguments, and pronounce the subject guilty or innocent, admirable or contemptible, tragic or absurd. Biographers do this. Documentarians do this. Judges obviously do this. The impulse is natural. We want closure. We want meaning. We want the final paragraph to land with the authority of a gavel striking wood. But John Stonehouse resists a verdict because John Stonehouse was never one thing. He was a socialist who spied for socialists and lived like a capitalist. He was a family man who abandoned his family. He was a patriot who betrayed his country for money so modest it barely covered his restaurant bills. He was a fraud who genuinely believed he was honest. He was a coward who displayed, in certain moments, something that resembled courage. The courage to stand up in Parliament after his resurrection. The courage to defend himself for 68 days in a courtroom. The courage, if that is the word, to look his daughter in the eye years later and attempt, however inadequately, to explain. He was a man of extraordinary gifts, intelligence, charm, energy, eloquence, and every one of those gifts was deployed in the service of deception. Not deception of others, though there was plenty of that. Deception of himself. The lies he told Barbara and Sheila and the House of Commons and the court and the reading public were secondary. The primary lie, the foundational lie, the lie upon which all the others rested, was the one he told himself, that he was special, that the rules did not apply, that the consequences that governed ordinary lives could be evaded by a man of sufficient imagination. He was not special. He was, in the end, ordinary, ordinary in his vanity, ordinary in his selfishness, ordinary in his inability to see other people as fully real. The extraordinariness of his story lies not in the man, but in the circumstances. Remove the Cold War, the parliamentary career, the beach, the passport, the swimming pool in Melbourne, and what remains is a story as old as marriage itself. A man who wanted more than he had, who lied to get it, and who discovered, too late, that more is not the same as enough. Barbara knew this. She knew it from the beginning, or she came to know it, or she always suspected it, and chose not to confirm the suspicion. Her silence, that magnificent, impenetrable silence, was not the absence of a verdict. It was the verdict itself. She looked at the wreckage of her marriage, at the man who had caused it, at the circus of cameras and courtrooms and tabloid headlines that his choices had unleashed, and she decided that the most powerful thing she could do was nothing. No interviews, no memoirs, no revenge. Just silence, the silence of a woman who has been asked to participate in someone else's drama and has declined the invitation. Sheila knew it too, though her knowledge took a different form. She had seen him at his worst, desperate, frightened, diminished, and had chosen to stay. Not out of ignorance, as Barbara might have stayed in the early years, but out of something harder to name. Call it love, if the word still applies after all it has been asked to carry in this story. Call it stubbornness. Call it the particular commitment of a person who has sacrificed too much to admit the sacrifice was wasted. Whatever it was, it held. Through the trial, through the prison years, through the bankruptcy and the obscurity and the slow cardiac decline. She was there at the end, or near the end, and she did not leave. Julia knew it last, because children always know last. They are the final recipients of the truth about their parents, the truth that arrives not in a single revelation, but in a slow accumulation of details, observations, overheard conversations, and silences that gradually assemble themselves into a picture the child did not ask to see. Julia's picture of her father took decades to develop. The memoir she published in 2021 was not a photograph, but an X-ray, an image that showed the bones beneath the skin, the fractures beneath the smile, the hollow spaces where love and trust had once been solid. She did not condemn him. She did not forgive him. She did something more difficult than either. She described him. Accurately, completely, without flinching. The father who was present and the father who was absent. The man who could fill a room with his charm and empty it with his selfishness. The politician who championed the oppressed while oppressing those closest to him. She held all of these contradictions together in her hands and on the page, and she did not drop any of them. That is not forgiveness. It is something rarer. It is understanding without absolution. 3 women, 3 forms of silence, 3 ways of surviving a man who could not survive himself. Barbara's silence said, "I refuse." Sheila's silence said, "I remain." Julia's words said, "I see." Together, they constitute the most complete portrait of John Stonehouse that exists, more complete than the MI5 file, more complete than the court transcripts, more complete than the obituaries or the biographies or the ITV drama. Because they describe not the public man but the private damage, not the scandal but the aftermath, not the explosion but the fallout, the invisible particles that drift through a family for generations, settling on surfaces that were clean before he touched them. Let us return one final time to the beach. The 20th of November, 1974. The Fontainebleau Hotel, Miami Beach. A man folds his clothes and walks away. The sun is warm. The sand is white. The Atlantic is calm. He does not look back, or if he does, no one sees him do it. He is 49 years old. He has been a husband for 26 years, a father for 23, a member of parliament for 17, a spy for 12, a lover for 5, and a fraud for however long you care to measure. He carries in his body the early stages of a disease that will kill him in 14 years. He carries in his suitcase the documents of a dead man whose name he has stolen. He carries in his head a plan that he believes is brilliant, and that is, in fact, merely desperate. He walks along the beach. The sunbathers do not notice him. The joggers do not notice him. The children building sandcastles do not look up. He is, for a few minutes, invisible, truly invisible, not performing invisibility but experiencing it. A man without a name, without a past, without a country. Just a body moving along the waterline, leaving footprints that the tide will erase. It is the closest he will ever come to freedom, and it lasts about an hour. After that, the taxi, the airport, the first-class ticket, the champagne, the dead man's passport, the hotel in Melbourne, the swimming pool, the steak, the bank visits, the second passport, The growing unease, the detectives, the trousers, the paper angel, the handcuffs, the extradition, the trial, the prison, the heart attacks, the surgery, the second marriage, the son, the small house in Totten, the television studio, the collapse, the hospital, the fluorescent lights at 2:30 in the morning, the silence. All of that, everything that followed. The entire second half of his life, compressed into 14 years of consequence, each one a response to the choice he made on that beach. He folded his clothes. He walked away. And he spent the rest of his life discovering that you cannot walk away from yourself. Not from the debts, not from the children, not from the woman you married when you were 23 and the world was young. Not from the woman you loved when you were 44 and the world was closing in. Not from the dead constituents whose names you stole. Not from the Czech intelligence officers to whom you sold your country's secrets for the price of a good dinner. Not from the scar on your chest. Not from the quiet, persistent, unanswerable question that your daughter will one day put on paper and send out into the world for strangers to read. Who were you, really? He had no answer. He never had an answer. The clothes on the beach were an attempt to avoid the question. The false passport was an attempt to avoid the question. The autobiography, the speeches, the interviews, the novels, the small political parties, the fundraising, the television appearances, all attempts, every one, to construct an answer that would hold. None of them held. The question outlived him. It outlives this account. It will outlive the ITV drama and the memoirs and the declassified files and the authorized histories and whatever else the future produces about a man who faked his own death and got caught. Because the question is not really about John Stonehouse. It is about all of us, about the distance between who we are and who we pretend to be, about the clothes we fold and the beaches we walk away from metaphorically, daily, in ways too small to be called disappearances, but too large to be called nothing. Every marriage contains a beach. Every career contains a pile of folded clothes. Every life contains a moment when the temptation to walk away, to shed the name, the debts, the obligations, the accumulated weight of being oneself, becomes so powerful that only habit, or duty, or cowardice, or love prevents us from doing exactly what John Stonehouse did. He acted on the impulse. Most of us do not. Whether that makes us wiser or merely less brave is a question I will leave with you. The story ends where it began, in Southampton, 2 miles from the house where a boy once watched ships leave for places he could only imagine. John Stonehouse spent his life running, from the working-class streets of his childhood to the corridors of Westminster. From the promises he made to Barbara to the secrets he kept for Prague. From the debts that closed in around him to the beach in Miami. From the prison cell that could not hold him to the hospital bed that finally did. He ran from who he was. He ran toward who he wished to be. In the end, the distance between those two men proved to be exactly 2 miles and a lifetime. This was the story of John Stonehouse, a man who drowned twice. The first time in the warm waters off Miami, where he left his clothes folded neatly on the sand and walked away believing he had escaped everything. The second time, quietly and finally, in a hospital room at 2:30 in the morning, when his heart, the one organ he had used least honestly of all, simply stopped. Only the second drowning was real, and only the second one stuck. Perhaps this story will stay with you. Perhaps it will surface, unbidden, the next time you fold a shirt or stand at a shoreline or catch yourself wondering what your life might look like if you could start it again from nothing. If it does, if some part of this account has earned a place in your memory, I would ask you to do something small. Press the button that tells the machine you were here. Leave a comment if you are so inclined. Share this with someone who might find it worth their time. These gestures cost nothing, but they matter. They are the difference between a story told to an empty room and a story that finds the people it was meant to reach. And if you have stayed until the end, through the beach and the prison and the chess games and the heart attacks and the 2 obituaries and the 3 women and the 1 unanswerable question, then I thank you, not for your attention, which is yours to give or withhold as you see fit, but for your patience. Because patience is what this story required, and patience is what you gave it. The ships are still leaving Southampton. They always will be. John Stonehouse is not on any of them. He is home.